Alright, today we're going to look at Chapter 6 over bones and skeletal tissue. We'll start with the skeletal cartilages because cartilage models are going to lead to bone. We'll go through the different types of cartilages that you learned about in Chapter 4, so that'll be a review, it'll just reiterate information. The general cartilage structure is going to be a lot of extracellular matrix with mature cartilage cells found in lacunae. The cartilage structure does not include nerves and it does not include blood vessels. So cartilage is both not innervated and it's avascular, so similar to epithelial tissue. What we didn't talk about in Chapter 4 is the fact that around cartilage molds is dense irregular connective tissue. There's this layer of dense irregular connective tissue called the perichondrium that not only holds these molds kind of in place, acting like a girdle, but also contains blood vessels. And those blood vessels are important for nutrient delivery to the cartilage cells, just like the dermal capillaries are important for nutrient delivery to the epithelial cells. So let's look at the perichondrium. The perichondrium is just going to be surrounding those cartilage molds. So here it is in the larynx, here's the hyaline cartilage down here, and then we just have a layer of dense irregular connective tissue surrounding cartilage models. The perichondrium as a term has the term chondro as a root term, or as a root word meaning cartilage and peri meaning surrounding. So this is really just a structure or tissue that surrounds the cartilage. And actually in the adult, we're going to see a periosteum as well. And the periosteum is just a different name for dense irregular connective tissue. Since it's around bone, it'll be called the periosteum, whereas right now this dense irregular connective tissue is around cartilage. Let's just review the different types of cartilage. We have hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. They all have chondrocytes in their lacunae. They have abundant extracellular matrix with a gel-like ground substance that's a little bit thicker than some of our other connective tissues, plus fibers. Hyaline cartilage still has that stained glass appearance. It's very flexible, resilient, it's a great cushion. It's important to note that hyaline cartilage is the most abundant type. Even if we don't count the embryonic skeleton, the mold or model of the embryonic skeleton, hyaline cartilage is still the most abundant. But for most of the embryonic skeleton, hyaline cartilage is the model. And then it's ossification or the calcification of that model before you're born that creates bone. There's different types of hyaline. We've talked about location before. Terms you may not have associated with hyaline cartilage before are articular cartilage, or costal cartilage, or even respiratory and nasal cartilages. So these are just names based on location for hyaline cartilage. So articular cartilage is found at the ends of long bones, so it's found at joints. Costal cartilage is the hyaline cartilage that connects your ribs to your sternum. The respiratory cartilages are found in your larynx and in your trachea, and the nasal cartilages are found close to the tip of your nose. Here's just a picture of hyaline cartilage. Again, this should be a review. We can see the chondrocyte and lacuna and the matrix. Elastic cartilage is found in the ear and the epiglottis, and it can withstand bending and then return to its original shape because it contains elastic fibers. So in this image, you can see the elastic fibers wrapping around the lacunae. With fibrocartilage, not only does it look the most fibrous, but it's able to withstand a lot of tensile strength. So it itself has great tensile strength, but it can be very compressed because of that tensile strength, so it can withstand shock. So it's definitely found in areas that are subjected to both pressure and stretch. Because it has really thick collagen fibers is why it appears so fibrous, and its locations are the meniscus or cushion of the knee. The knee itself is under great gravitational force, so it's great that we have fibrocartilage there. The intervertebral disc, that's when we kind of move left and right. There's a lot of twisting kind of movement available for our vertebrae. And then the pubic symphysis, so the pelvic bones need to be able to shift or slightly move if they undergo certain pressure or stretch. Here's a picture of fibrocartilage on the left, and you can also see the lateral and medial meniscus in light pink in this image. Here's a good cheat sheet. Again, this should be review, so make sure if you need more detailed information about cartilage itself or about connective tissue, you go back to Chapter 4. Next, we're going to talk about cartilage growth, and we're going to talk about cartilage growth even though this chapter is about bone, because bone grows in a similar manner. So cartilage grows in two ways. It has both appositional and interstitial growth. Appositional growth is growth from the outside, so you're going to have the addition of tissue from the outside, whereas interstitial growth is growth from the inside and tends to increase the length of a cartilage model, whereas appositional tends to increase the width. Cartilage itself can calcify. A lot of times if cartilage calcifies, that's going to be a homeostatic imbalance. It especially happens during old age, but there is calcification associated with osteogenesis that is related to normal bone growth. So again, let's just look at those two types of growth, appositional versus interstitial. So for appositional, you're going to have cartilage-forming cells called chondroblasts. They're going to be in between the surrounding perichondrium and the cartilage model, and they would secrete matrix against that external surface of the existing cartilage and add width to that cartilage model. Whereas in interstitial, you're going to have chondrocytes themselves perform mitosis and divide, and then their divided cells would be not as mature and they would secrete new matrix, and that would expand cartilage from within but also lengthen that model. And don't forget that around our models of cartilage we have a perichondrium. We have a vascularized piece of dense irregular connective tissue that's going to allow diffusion of nutrients into our cartilage model. So if we just compare the two, appositional growth from outside, interstitial growth from inside, chondroblasts are going to be responsible for laying down matrix, but interstitial chondrocytes must divide to create chondroblasts. So you'll see from within the lacunae mitosis of the chondrocytes for interstitial growth. And biggest differences for appositional growth, we'll see increases in width, whereas for interstitial growth, we'll see increases in length. Next, let's talk about some anatomy. So first and foremost, here's an interesting and important fact. There are 206 named bones in the human body. And of those 206, we could put them into two categories. We could either say that bone belongs in the axial skeleton or that bone belongs in the appendicular skeleton. Now, the limbs plus their girdles, those are going to be the parts of the appendicular skeleton. So both your scapula, your clavicle, and your pelvic bones actually are a part of your appendicular skeleton. And then for your axial skeleton, it's pretty much the long axis or kind of trunk of your body, but also includes your skull and your vertebral column and your rib cage. So we have a lot of protective functions for the axial skeleton, whereas mobility or locomotion, kind of manipulation of the environment, would be the function of the appendicular skeleton. So here is axial versus appendicular color-coded. So you can see the axis of the body right down the middle, skull, vertebrae, rib cage, even the sacrum and the coccyx, that's going to be the axial skeleton, whereas the appendicular skeleton is made up of your collarbone, that's your clavicle, that chicken wing bone on your back is the scapula, and then your limb bones, both upper and lower, including your pelvic bone, those are going to be appendicular. So spend some time with an image like this. Know the basic bones, like you call, for right now, you could call these limb bones, lower limb bones, hip bones, clavicle, scapula. Just get familiar with some of the main terms. Here's another image that combines both the hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage cheat sheets with an axial and appendicular color-coded skeleton. Next, let's talk about the 4 types of bones with bone classification. You could have long bones, and long bones don't have to be gigantic. They don't have to be very large. The femur is the largest long bone, but in general, the shape of the long bone is just longer than it is wide. It has 2 expanded ends, and it has a narrow middle. The expanded ends are called the epiphyses, whereas the middle is called the diaphysis. If you really want to see a small long bone, just look at the finger bones. The finger bones, because of their shape, are actually considered long bones, but they're not large like the femur. Then there's short bones. Short bones are cube-shaped, your carpals, your tarsals, great examples. Flat bones are flat, but usually curved. So, for example, you'd want to count your ribs and your sternum. Even your scapula, even though they're slightly irregular, we'd count those as flat bones. And then the 2 irregular bones that we see the most are going to be the sphenoid and ethmoid bone. Those would be in the skull, but vertebrae, hip bones, those are also going to be irregular bones. And irregular bones just don't really fit in any of the other 3 classes because they're irregular or their shape doesn't quite match up to either being a short, long, or flat bone. So they go in this irregular bone classification system. Here are some really stark examples we can see of a long bone versus a flat bone, and then irregular versus a short bone. Really only the wrist and ankle bones, which are the carpal and tarsal bones, would be considered short bones. Your patella kind of goes in that category of short bone, but it's actually considered a sesamoid shaped bone. But if you have to put it in any category, you would put it in the short bone category. The functions of bones are very varied, just like that of epithelial tissue and connective tissue. There's a lot of different tissues that make up bones themselves, and bones are considered an organ. Bones contain dense irregular connective tissue. They contain not only bone tissue, but also blood vessels and muscle. So bones, as we move forward, when we're talking about their anatomy, we're talking about an organ. There's definitely support, gives you the framework for your body. It protects soft organs like your lungs if you talk about your rib cage. There's protection also, think about your dorsal body cavity and your vertebrae and your cranium. They're protecting the central nervous system. Plenty of movement because skeletal muscle can attach to bones and therefore use the skeleton as levers to push and pull upon. And then storage, deposits, and withdrawals, what that's talking about is the fact that bones store things like calcium and phosphate. Calcium, phosphate, salts, it's actually a really important fact, are some of the things that you would find in the mineral deposits that get put in bone to make it hard. There's also plenty of growth factors. We store fat, so triglyceride or energy storage is another thing that you see, especially in the diaphysis of long bones. So there's actually a space called the medullary cavity where fat is stored in adults. And then blood cell formation. In the red marrow of bones, a process called hematopoiesis takes place. That's blood cell generation, so that includes red blood cells, white blood cells, even platelets, which are fragments of cells called megakaryocytes. So we have blood cell formation, storage and deposits, whether it's minerals or fat, movement, protection, and support. So a very wide range and varied functions for bone. Next, let's keep looking at anatomy, and let's talk about bones as organs. So I've mentioned that, but what are the tissues that are coming together to make up bone and make it an organ? Well, I've mentioned some of them. Of course, osseous tissue, of course, bone. But bone is also innervated. Bone has blood vessels. So that means that bone has muscle and epithelial tissue. And then we have fibrous connective tissue on the inside and the outside. And there's some cartilage that hangs around. There's plenty of tissues to be found in this very dynamic structure that is bone. So before I go forward, I just want to make a note. You may have noticed that I said bone has nerves and bone is vascular. Well, cartilage, which is pretty much our model for bone, did not have nerves and did not have blood vessels. So from our model, which was hyaline cartilage, to now bone as the organ, there's definitely been a structural change because we went from something without nerves or blood vessels to something with nerves and blood vessels. So not only is there going to be a nutrient exchange, there's going to be a nervous system intervention. But let's just go back to our bone textures, but that information is going to come back. Our basic bone textures are compact versus spongy bone. And compact bone will be what we focus on the most, but spongy bone is definitely very interesting to look at. You have spongy bone lining the medullary cavity, you have it in the epiphyses of long bones, you find it between plates of compact bone and flat bones. And the needle-like projections that make up most of spongy bone are called trabeculae. So let's look at some of those needle-like projections. Here's some. So those are trabeculae. Unlike compact bone, you're not going to have any osteons in spongy bone. Osteons are going to be the unit of compact bone, and we'll look at their structure in depth. Here is spongy bone between two compact bone sheets, kind of like a spongy bone skull sandwich. So this is a flat bone of the skull, and here we have the spongy bone, and when it's found in flat bones, it's sometimes called diploe. And then you just have those two layers of compact bone. Spongy bone tends to be a little bit more internal than compact bone. Compact bone tends to be on the outside of bone that's acting as an organ. Here is an up-close view of those trabeculae. So these spicules, again, are called trabeculae, and their curved surface creates a lot of strength to bone. Here are histology images showing you compact versus spongy bone. Over here on the left, we can see a lot of central canals where there would be blood vessels. On the right, we can see the trabeculae. We can see those spicules, the pointy parts. And then actually in between the trabeculae of this image, we're seeing yellow bone marrow, which is just fat tissue. That's why you have this light bubble appearance. When we're talking about bone, whether it's a short, irregular, or flat bone, we're going to be talking about a lot of connective tissues that encompass them. So these types of bones, short, irregular, and flat, they consist of thin plates of spongy bone covered by compact bone. So that spongy bone again and those short, irregular, flat bones tends to be called diploid. Both these types of bones and long bones are covered inside and outside by connective tissue membranes. On the outside, they're covered by dense irregular connective tissue, and what used to be called the perichondrium is now the periosteum, and we've just changed that root word again because now that dense irregular connective tissue is covering bone instead of cartilage. So it's just a terminology change, not a structure change. Something that gets introduced to bone is connective tissue on the inside, and that connective tissue covering would be the endosteum. It generally covers spongy bone, which is found more within compared to the compact bone. Again, in flat bones, we have spongy bone called diploid. Bone marrow is found between the trabeculae, so we would have red bone marrow, especially in the epiphyses of long bones. And then where bones articulate, so that's where bones come together, where they form joints, you'd still have a little bit of hyaline cartilage left over. So let's look at the structure of a long bone. It seems to be kind of what we're staying away from, but it's actually going to be our main focus for when we talk about bones. So we have the shaft or the thinner region of a long bone. That's called the diaphysis. And then the two expanded ends are called epiphyses. You would have a spongy bone interior on the epiphyses, and you would have an epiphyseal line if someone had stopped growing, because that's the remnant of an epiphyseal plate. So in a child who is still growing, after they've been born, they would have a layer of cartilage between at least one side or one epiphyseal side of a long bone, and we'll talk more about that. But spongy bone interior, especially of the epiphyses, usually you have lining spongy bone for the diaphysis. You'd have an epiphyseal line if someone had stopped growing, and an epiphyseal plate if someone's still growing. And then on the ends of the long bones, that's where you'd find that articular cartilage. In the diaphysis, you have a space, that's the medullary cavity. Usually around that, again, that's where you have that layer of spongy bone, but completely encompassing the entire shaft would be a compact bone collar. So here we have the anatomy of a long bone. So we can see at the ends of the long bone, we have the shiny articular cartilage, that's hyaline cartilage. You have a narrow shaft and two expanded ends. The shaft is the diaphysis. Then you have the epiphyses. This is the humerus, and the proximal epiphyses would be the closest to your shoulder joint, whereas the distal epiphyses is closer to your elbow. So they're using the terms proximal and distal correctly. We have spongy bone in the middle of the epiphyses, the epiphyseal line, which is just a layer of compact bone. That means this individual, whoever this bone was from, had stopped growing. If not, you'd have a layer of cartilage here, and it would be called an epiphyseal plate instead of a line. And then you have some more spongy bone, but it opens up into a space that's filled with yellow marrow in adults. Yellow marrow is just fat. You also have an outside covering that would be the periosteum. You can also see some of that light blue wrapping around the bone itself, so that's periosteum. And the endosteum would coat the inside. It also would wrap around the trabeculae. You can also see there's plenty of openings from compact bone to inside near the spongy bone for blood vessels to branch off and weave through these structures in order to provide vascularization to the entire organ. So let's talk more about the periosteum. The periosteum surrounds bone. It's a double-layered membrane. The outside layer is fibrous, the inside layer is mitotic. The inner layer is called the osteogenic layer. It is closer to the bone surface than the outer fibrous layer, and this is the layer that has osteogenic, kind of stem cell-like cells. They're going to give rise to all the bone cells like osteoblasts and osteocytes, except for osteoclasts, which do not arise from the same type of cell as osteogenic cells or even most connective tissue cells. Osteoclasts actually come from the hematopoietic stem cell. We find that the periosteum not only has a great blood supply, that during the process of ossification it was able to share this blood supply to the bone. That's why bone itself is richly supplied with nerve fibers and blood, just like the periosteum. Those blood vessels from the periosteum are able to pass through the shaft into central canals and Volkmann's canals, and then into or between the trabeculae of spongy bone. There's also perforating sharp base fibers, which make sure the periosteum is held onto the bone. And again, these are just collagen fibers that extend and into the bone matrix in order to secure the periosteum to the bone. The periosteum is also a great attachment site for ligaments and tendons. So again, looking at the basis of bone, spongy bone tends to be more internal, then compact bone, diaphysis is the shaft, epiphyses are the expanded ends, the periosteum surrounds the outside of bone, the endosteum surrounds the inside, the medullary canal is a cavity in the diaphysis that contains yellow bone marrow, which is fat. The compact bone collar of the diaphysis contains osteons. The periosteum contains blood vessels that go into bone, making sure it's also vascularized. And perforating or Sharpey's fibers are able to attach themselves to bone matrix. Here's just a better view of the endosteum. So just like the periosteum, it's a connective tissue membrane, but it covers the inside versus the outside. So it's not only able to cover central canals, but also the trabeculae of spongy bone. And it also contains, like the periosteum, osteogenic cells. Here's just a better view of the endosteum. So they don't even color it very different compared to the layer of spongy bone in the trabeculae, but there would be a layer of connective tissue inside, just like there is outside. Alright, next we're going to talk about the location of hematopoietic tissue. The term hematopoietic means blood cell generating, or blood generating. So hemat means blood, poietic means producing or generating. This is blood generating, generally referring to cells. And the function of red marrow cavities in bone is blood cell production. In adults, you would find red bone marrow, in the heads of the femur and the humerus, in the sternum and the hip bone, so some flat bones, but also the heads of long bones. But in newborn infants, pretty much the medullary cavities of almost all of their long bones are going to contain red marrow, and that will lessen as they get older. Next, we're going to look at bone markings. So there's different depressions and projections and openings or holes. Don't spend too much time on this. Your lab class will test this more, but you should have a general idea about bone markings, so the term itself shouldn't catch you off guard. You would find certain bone markings at the sites of attachment for muscles and ligaments, maybe the ends of long bones. So joint surfaces and areas that are conduits for blood vessels and nerves are great locations to find bone markings of these bumps, depressions, or projections. So you have tuberosities, crests, trochanters, lines, tubercles, epicondyles, spines, and processes. So I just wanted to go through those terms in order to tell you how you say them. For example, you have a tibial tuberosity on the tibia. There's the iliac crest on your hip bone. There's the greater and lesser trochanter on the femur, or the greater and lesser tubercle on the humerus. There's epicondyles on different bones, generally long bones. You would find epicondyles, for example, on the tibia. And then you have spines, like the ischial spine, which is between the greater and lesser sciatic notch. And then you have processes, like the spinous process. There's also heads, facets, condyles, ramus. Just be familiar with these bony marking or projection names. For example, here is the head of the femur. Then it has a greater and then a lesser on the other side trochanter. There's also on the femur the linea aspera, so that's a type of line. And then here on the femur you have epicondyles and condyles. Other bony markings are meatus, sinus, a fossa, a groove, a fissure, or foramen. So we're going to talk about fossa, fissure, and foramen just because they're similar. A fossa is a depression, so it's not a hole. It's not completely through. So it's really shallow. It's just a dent or a depression, however you want to think about it. Whereas a foramen is an actual hole. It can be round or oval, but it's an opening through the bone. So you could have something like a nerve or blood vessel go through a foramen, whereas that would not occur in a fossa. And then a fissure is closer to a foramen than a fossa because a fissure is an opening, but it's slit-like, not round or oval. So that would be a fissure. So in this example, for this image, which is looking at the base of the skull, you would see that, for example, number 9 is a foramen, whereas 10 is going to be a fossa. And that's where we're going to end because I want to look at the microscopy of cells that make up bone in the next video. So make sure that you're really comfortable with bone anatomy before proceeding forward.